Today we're going to learn about statements and operators in JavaScript. Let's get started. Hey there everyone, and welcome to a continuation of Loop Coding Center's Intro to Web Dev. In this series, so far we've touched in HTML and CSS, and today we'll continue on from our previous episode by continuing on the basics of JavaScript. Today we'll specifically continue with what we learned on variables last week, and actually classify them as what they are technically, a statement. Whenever we declare a variable as such, we're making a statement within the scope of JavaScript. So, today, we'll touch on exactly what a statement is, variables that land under statements, the types of variables that we have available, as well as some operators we can use to manipulate the variables that we'll be working with. So, today, with that, we'll move into our setup. So, to begin with the setup today, really all we'll need is the exact same CodePen window that we've had set up for the previous episodes. Here we'll just have a blank workshop for JavaScript, and ideally if you can go ahead and set up your inspection window, which will require just a bit of adjustment from me because I have it set to a different window, but with a slight adjustment of that we can go ahead and transition into focusing on the subject of a statement. With a statement, we essentially have a way to tell our program or our computer program that we're defining something. We're defining an operator, a variable, expressions, keywords, maybe even a comment in your code. All of these things are what we would consider, or the computer would consider, statements. They don't necessarily have to cause something to happen. They can simply define something. They don't necessarily have to cause the pushing of something to get something else rolling. They can simply be. And just like how you can say something in an audience, not everyone is required to respond. So with a statement, you'll find that you really are primarily defining things, but also setting things up for the actual functions that will be taking place in JavaScript. And with that, this relates directly to our topic of variables and the types of variables. Last week we touched on integers and we touched on strings, but today we'll explore the different variables that are available within JavaScript, as well as how we can play around with them using operators. Now today we'll further clarify the variables we worked with last week. Last week I introduced the idea of integers and strings. Primarily integers, and really when it comes to JavaScript, unlike other programming languages, you'll find that you're only working with numbers. So it's not just integers or whole numbers really. The thing with JavaScript is that it identifies all numbers as just purely numbers. The decimals, the leading places don't really matter when it comes to how JavaScript defines a number. And this particularly makes it really bad for math operations when it comes to specific things like financial tech and things that are more reliant on numbers, because JavaScript is more likely to miscompile or miscalculate your numbers based on just the nature of its programming. So with that, we really have two main objects outside of our third object that we really, as programmers, have complete control over. So the third object you'll find is what's considered an object. Now, with an object, we'll actually have an entire video based on that subject, but simply put, an object's an item that takes multiple variables and puts them in a nice little box for us to be able to define an object or a thing as having multiple characteristics. So with that, I'll go ahead and actually type out the two that will really matter to us today. So we'll have var x, which is equal to 2, alongside our variable, not car, but variable y, that's equal to the spelled out version of 2. And like that, we can have both x and y print out in our code. So if we look over in our console to the right, we have 2 and 2 printing out. So with that, let's go ahead and transition into operators to see how we can have operators create a sentence per se using these variables and through the means of statements that we've declared so far. Now, operators are actually a pretty simple concept. So when it comes down to it, operators are what you're familiar with when you use a calculator every day for school, specifically for math class obviously, or maybe even science. But considering that fact, really what we're looking for with the idea of an operator is the fact of addition, subtraction, multiplication, exponents, modulus, which is something we'll specifically touch on, division, increments, and decreasing, really. With these things, we'll just have some basic math operations that we can use to have things print out in JavaScript. So with that, I'm actually going to print out that sentence I had explained. And I'll do so by changing the value of x, and actually I'll do so by teaching you the fact that variables in JavaScript are actually what are called dynamic. Meaning, if you declare a variable through a statement on the first line of your code, and then on line 3 decide to change the value, it will change. So put in simpler terms, or put in practice, if I set x equal to 2 and then set it if I have my y set equal to 2 and then with x set it equal to the value is the second number, and then instead of using a comma, add the 2 together, we'll find that 2 is the second number, but the sentence isn't proper because I need to set it up as so. So 2 is the second number. But we do have an issue of there not being space in how things are printed out. But before we fix that issue, you can clearly see that instead of x being equal to 2, as we initially had declared it, we'll find that x is now equal to the sentence I wrote out. And now with our equation, with the addition of our operator, the plus sign, or addition, we were able to have y print out, so 2, and then x print out with its newly defined dynamic dynamic change that set it equal to is the second number. So adding the 2 together, we have the sentence 2 is the second number. And to quickly fix it, I'll go ahead and add another operator, and in between add a space quotation. So now, if we look over in our console, we have 2, the space that we added through these quotes is the second number. And like that, we can add strings together to concatenate and or form together sentences. So with that, we can also do the same and provide any math functions you can think of. With that, let's go ahead and demo what some of our other operators can offer in terms of functionality in JavaScript. Now, to demo these in a quick fashion, what I've done is set up a list of variables and statements that allow for me to manipulate the variable of x through the use of the different arithmetic operators that are available through JavaScript. So with that, we have our basic addition, subtraction, multiplication, exponents, division, modulus, which we'll explain a little, and increment and decrease as well. So with this, if we go ahead and save our code, or set this variable to 3 instead of 2, we should see our code pop into place. And with that, we'll find each of these operations taking place. So 2 plus 3 is equal to 5, 2 minus 3 is equal to -1, 2 times 3 is 6, 2 to the power of 3 is 8, divided by 2 divided by, and here I should actually be placing x, so a mistake on my part, And actually, to best show the modulus, I'll actually set the variable back to 2, so that you can see that with modulus, essentially what you're doing is seeing how many times you can fit a number into something with only leaving the leftover part into it. So for modulus, I'd specifically research into the subject because it's kind of a weird math thing, which is something we could definitely touch on, but I want to primarily focus on just how the operators work and how we can use them to create things within JavaScript, which will be our primary focus of the next episode. However, for today, I'd like for you to go through this list, compare and contrast these two different console.logs, and just see that it's pretty much the same operations that you have on a calculator. And if you do have a TI-84 or above, you're actually able to program some little text adventure games or your own little programs on these calculators if you'd like. So with that, today we've learned about statements, how variables fall under statements, operators and how we can use them to add our variables and statements together, as well as the nature of variables and how they're dynamic instead of just these static objects that can't be changed. Though that will be a topic we touch on, as JavaScript does have the capabilities to do so. So with that, we'll leave today off and in the following episode transition into the idea of objects within JavaScript, which is the primary purpose. So until then, have a nice week.